Alright, let's be honest. The G20 is messy enough as it is. It's like a family reunion where everyone brought their unresolved baggage. Except instead of passive-aggressive potato salad comments, it's about trade wars and nuclear proliferation. But believe it or not, there's a whole other world of geopolitical chaos happening outside the G20. Places where the phrase emerging economy feels a bit like calling a dumpster fire an opportunity for urban renewal. And that's what we're diving into today, folks. We're talking about the geopolitical hotspots that don't get the same headline space as, say, whatever the G20 is arguing about this week, but are just as important to understand. We're taking a cue from this article, Global Power Clash. Top 5 non-G20 battlegrounds, and trust me, it's about as cheery as it sounds. So buckle up, because things are about to get internationally intriguing. First up, we have Syria, a country that's been embroiled in a civil war for over a decade. Now you might think, a decade? That's a long time. Did someone forget to tell them it's over? And the answer is, well, it's complicated. You see, Syria has become a proxy battleground for global powers. On one side, you have the US and its allies backing various rebel groups with the stated goal of, let's say, promoting democracy. On the other side, you have Russia and Iran, propping up the Assad regime with the equally noble goal of, let's say, not letting the US have its way. The result? A humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. Millions displaced, countless lives lost, and a country left in ruins. It's like that friend's apartment after a particularly messy breakup, except instead of empty pizza boxes, it's, well, significantly worse. And just when you thought it couldn't get any more convoluted, you have other players like Turkey and Kurdish forces adding their own agendas to the mix. It's a geopolitical pressure cooker, and the only thing that seems to be cooking is more instability. Next, we travel to Eastern Europe, where Russia decided to spice things up by, just casually annexing Crimea from Ukraine back in 2014. It was a move that sent shockwaves through the international community, like that friend who shows up to a potluck with a store-bought bucket of chicken and calls it homemade. The West responded with sanctions, which, let's be honest, are about as effective as a strongly worded letter to a dictator. But it's not just about land, oh no. This is about Russia reasserting its influence in the region and pushing back against NATO expansion. Think of it as a geopolitical game of risk, except the stakes are real lives, and the players take themselves far too seriously. And just when you thought the situation couldn't escalate further, well, let's just say recent events have proven that assumption wrong. Now, let's head south to Venezuela, a country that's practically swimming in oil yet somehow managed to completely run out of toilet paper. It's a tale as old as time government mismanagement, corruption, and a dash of hyperinflation for good measure. But here's where it gets interesting. Venezuela has two presidents. Yes, you heard that right, two. You have Nicolas Maduro, who's clinging to power like a cat hanging onto a curtain, and Juan Guaido, who's recognized by many Western countries as the legitimate leader. It's a political standoff that would be comical if it weren't for the very real humanitarian crisis unfolding on the ground. People are struggling to afford basic necessities, and the country's infrastructure is crumbling faster than a cookie in a toddler's hand. And of course, no geopolitical crisis would be complete without the meddling of foreign powers. The US, eager to see Maduro gone, has imposed sanctions that have only exacerbated the economic crisis. Meanwhile, Russia and China are more than happy to prop up Maduro's regime, seeing it as a way to thumb their noses at the US. Speaking of countries the US has a complicated relationship with, let's talk about Iran. This is a nation with a rich history, beautiful culture, and a government that seems hell-bent on acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, Iran insists its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes, but the rest of the world is about as convinced as you are when your dog tries to look innocent after eating an entire birthday cake. The result? Years of sanctions, tense negotiations, and the constant threat of military action. It's like a high-stakes game of poker, except the chips are enriched uranium and the players are prone to making very public threats. And finally, we come to Afghanistan, a country that's been through more turmoil than a suitcase on a baggage carousel. After 2 decades of war, the US finally withdrew its troops in 2021, leaving the Taliban back in control. It was a chaotic exit, to say the least, and the situation in Afghanistan remains fragile. The Taliban has promised a more moderate rule this time around, but their definition of moderate seems to involve a lot less freedom and a lot more oppression, particularly for women and girls. The international community is watching closely, trying to figure out how to engage with the Taliban without legitimizing their rule. It's a delicate balancing act, like trying to parallel park a tank in a china shop. Well, there you have it, folks. A whirlwind tour of some of the most volatile places on the planet. It's enough to make you want to crawl under your weighted blanket and never come out. But hey, at least we're not talking about the G20 anymore, right? Because as messy as these situations are, they highlight a crucial point. The world is a complex and interconnected place, and what happens in one corner of the globe can have ripple effects far beyond its borders. So, the next time you're feeling overwhelmed by the news, just remember, it could always be worse. You could be living in one of these places. And on that cheery note,